Welcome back. We're continuing to talk about tone, and we're going to get right into how we control that in exposure. Let's get going. The visual element of tone, also known as value, is another important tool that we must be aware of in constructing our pictures. This aspect is primarily related to darkness and lightness in the scene itself, and in the ways the photographer can make the scene appear. If the overall tonal value of your photograph is dark, what meanings does that lead the viewer to consider? What special things can a generally dark scene convey that other tonal values cannot? Does a picture like this one convey the promise of a new day, or the doom and gloom that is always lurking in the foreground or background of life? In this photograph of a hillside cluster of houses on the island of Santorini, when we were sailing into port in the early morning, the sun had just risen recently to the east, but had not yet gotten high enough to directly light this part of the island. The moisture in the air diffused the light and created an airy, atmospheric environment. If the overall tonal value is light and airy, what meaning does that bring to the picture? Does it make it more dreamy? Is it more mysterious and evocative? Will the viewer's imagination be given freedom to roam? Whether the overall tonal values of a photograph are light or dark, the visual element of tone conveys a particular set of messages to the viewer. As with other visual elements, we need to choose how much or how little to emphasize this element based on what our goals are for the message we want to communicate. In this photograph of a narrow canal in Venice, with a gondola parked under a lamp at night, the murky atmosphere gives a very different tone to the scene. During the day, the scene is a bustle of activity with tourists, merchants, and of course, the bright Venetian sun creating a light contrast. The vast majority of photographs of Venetian canals and gondolas that I've seen are made during the day, and I've made plenty of them myself. But why photograph only when the normal tonal values are present? One of the creative approaches you might enjoy most is finding opportunities to use tonal values opposite of the norm to create new insights for viewers, new ways to see subjects that reveal something more. Hadrian's Arch in Athens is photographed all day long by tourists who are visiting the area of the temple of Olympian Zeus. When I went back at night, I was the only person there. What I was able to capture was an image which mixes the hustle and bustle of the modern city and the remnants of the old, infused with a mystery that only comes from a dark overall tone at night. Is there a landmark you take for granted in your part of the world that is photographed often? Is there a message you can convey through an imaginative use of the element of tone? Of course there is. In addition to trying to creatively respond to the tones that are in the scene, as photographers, we can change the tones themselves simply by changing the exposure settings on our cameras to increase or decrease the amount of light that can affect the sensor or film. We can make the same things appear lighter or darker. Here, the sky is as close to normal in tonal range as I could record it, with the curious circular rainbow hovering above me in the sky while I was on a job in the Bahamas. In this version, the amount of exposure to light in the camera was increased by using a slower shutter speed. The sky is brighter and verges on becoming an abstraction completely unrelated to the original subject matter. In this version, less light than normal was allowed to affect the sensor by using a faster shutter speed, with the result being a darker sky, perhaps a stronger statement about the rainbow colors, but also creating a mysterious mood. Here are 3 more pictures, this time of a soccer ball half buried in snow that a dog has had some fun playing with. The differences in tones in each picture result from changes in exposure of what we refer to as one stop each. The phrase one stop simply means either doubling the amount of light that will hit the sensor or cutting that amount in half, accomplished by changing the f-stop or the shutter speed settings. Would you agree that the picture in the center is what most of us would call the normal exposure? Well, I would too, but it may surprise you to learn that it is not the exposure that was recommended by the camera light meter. Are you curious? Well, let's get to the rest of the story. Even though this lesson is primarily about the visual element of tone, I feel it's important to add a little technical information at this point to help you understand not only the artistic aspect of tone, but also how we can control it in photography, and how, if we do not understand how our camera's light meter works, it can get out of control. I know Professor Sullivan has covered exposure with you, but we're going to go over it a little bit more here. The zone system was popularized by Ansel Adams, the great American landscape photographer, who used it to achieve the beautiful print tonalities for which his photographs are well known. It's based on a chart of zones of tonality, zone 0 being the blackest black that the paper can create from exposure and development, and zone 11 being the whitest white of the paper itself. In the middle is zone 5, which is middle gray. Middle gray is a tone that reflects 18% of the light that hits it. And almost every reflected light meter in existence is calibrated for that tonality. On this chart, that middle gray is set at 0 EV. EV stands for exposure value. The significance of this will become clear to you in just a moment. What that means for us in the digital world is this. If you set your camera meter so that instead of taking an average reading of the whole scene, it only meters a small spot, you have chosen what is known as spot metering. This illustration of a viewfinder in a Canon camera indicates the small area that would be metered. In that mode, the meter is only reading the luminosity, the brightness or darkness of whatever spot in the picture you place it over. If you place the spot over something that is very white, something that is very brightly reflecting light, the calibration of the meter for middle gray will give you an exposure that will render that bright area middle gray. In this photograph, you see that when I used the spot meter and measured the light reflecting from that bright snow, the snow was rendered middle gray. In this photograph, I increased the exposure by a factor of +1 exposure value, overexposing compared to what the meter was reading by decreasing the shutter speed from 1/800th of a second to 1/400th of a second. For each plus or minus number you adjust your exposure using the exposure value scale, also known as EV, you double or halve the amount of light that will hit the sensor. In this photograph, I chose EV +2, and that slowed the shutter speed again, this time from 1/400th of a second to 1/200th of a second. This picture is the one that I would consider normal for the tones in the scene. You're probably either remembering a similar lesson on adjusting exposure in courses 1 and 2, or wondering how you can make the same adjustments to control the tones of your own pictures if you've forgotten those lessons, or you just joined the specialization with this course. That's why I'm reviewing this technical information now, so you can creatively adjust the tones in your photographs as you respond to the tones in each scene as necessary. Let's take a look at this chart more closely. On the left side, you'll see exposure value adjustments that we might make if we start off at 0 EV by metering something that is actually a mid-tone. And certainly both middle gray and green grass are a good place to start. The chart will help you visualize what things are various shades of gray lighter or darker than middle gray. For example, a lighter blue sky is about 1 EV lighter than middle gray. In all of these progressions, the change from one level of gray to another, whether moving lighter or darker, is the change of doubling or halving the amount of light that will hit the sensor. On all but the simplest digital cameras, there is a way to purposely over and underexpose the picture to adjust for the meter being fooled by extreme lighting conditions. Unless you want your pictures to be darker than normal, while that can be a creative stance that a photographer might take, you'll want to be able to achieve the range of tones that are normal if that's what you want. Now, on many cameras, it will be indicated by a little scale like the one you see in the center of this image. This is what a person using a Canon 5D Mark II camera might see in their viewfinder, with the exposure combination on the left, 1/250th of a second at f5.6, and the ISO of 100 and the frame number of 78 on the right. In the middle is the scale I referred to, with an arrowhead shape in the center and plus or minus signs and numbers left and right. In this instance, there's no adjustment of the meter's recommended exposure, with the arrow point and indicator bar below it lined up. If that lower indicator bar were moved to the left, it would indicate that the photographer was purposely underexposing the picture. If it were moved to the right, it would mean overexposure was being ordered. You will need to review your own camera manual to determine where your EV scale is and how to adjust the exposure. Here's a range of photographs made of my iPad cover suspended above the snow. Each picture in the line above at +1 EV or -1 EV from the adjacent frame left or right. Your understanding that these kinds of changes in overall tone are possible and that they are yours to control is critical to becoming a successful photographer, not only to record normal tones, but to make creative use of tone as well. So take all the artistic and technical information about tone into account as you create your pictures, but be aware that the overall tones, the darkness and lightness of the scene are yours to decide.